Welcome to the STEM Talk podcast, your 30-minute monthly STEM pulse check. Hosted by the After School STEM Hub, STEM Education Coalition, and STEM Ecosystems by TIES. The STEM Talk podcast creates a safe space for dialogue while maintaining a focus on information that matters to you and the communities you serve. In just 30 minutes each month, join our experts from across the STEM landscape as they provide factual information, practical strategies, and actionable resources to help you navigate the ever-changing world of STEM education, workforce development, policy, and advocacy. Welcome to the STEM Talk podcast, episode number 3, Budget Impacts on STEM. This vital conversation is brought to you by the STEM Education Coalition, After School STEM Hub, and STEM Ecosystems. Hi, my name is Jenny Frank, and I am the director of the STEM Ecosystems Initiative. Today, we are welcoming back our expert guests, James Brown, Executive Director of the STEM Education Coalition, and Della Cronin, Principal at Bose Public Affairs Group. They will be providing an overview of the current STEM funding landscape and the impact of proposed federal budget cuts on STEM education and research funding across multiple agencies, including the NSF and Department of Education. James brings his valuable expertise and perspective at the intersection of science and policy, while Della contributes her extensive experience in shaping federal education initiatives. Together, they'll help us to understand how to translate recent policy developments into actionable strategies. James, Della, thank you both for joining us again. We're grateful for your continued support and expertise as we work together to strengthen STEM globally. Let's begin our conversation.
So today we're going to talk about the budget and some of the things related to the budget that are going on in DC. And I want to start by explaining a little bit of Congress 101, which is that there are two tracks in the U.S. federal government around how we make spending priority decisions. One is the annual appropriations process. This is the process that we're going to talk about first with the budget proposal from the administration, appropriations bills, rescission packages, DOGE cuts, things like that that affect the spending for the current year and future fiscal years. That's the official budget process. And then we have a second process going on that normally occurs in the first or second year of a new administration called reconciliation. It's the process Congress established several decades ago that allows for changes in tax policy, healthcare policy, and anything that involves mandatory federal government spending. So this was the vehicle used to pass numerous tax cuts. The Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, was passed this way. And this is the path that ultimately leads to dealing with levels of national debt, the debt limit, and things in that bucket. But we're going to talk about these because they're two separate processes. Della?
So, you all may have heard recently that the White House has put out its annual budget request. And to James's point, this is part of the annual spending process, spending and appropriations. And I would like to emphasize that it is a budget request that he sends, the White House sends to Congress for that outlines how the White House would like to see the federal government spend money every year. No surprise that this White House has proposed significant reductions to a number of agencies, building on the work that has come from DOGE, building on campaign promises to shrink the size and cost of the federal government. So most agencies would have their budgets cut significantly. You can see from this chart here that significant cuts would happen at the Department of Education. What's not on this chart, but is also true, it also would cut the National Science Foundation significantly. Overall, non-defense spending would come down compared to last year by about 17%. And not surprisingly, given the president's rhetoric, there is a call for increases on national security. This plan also is worth noting, assumes enactment of what Republicans are working on Capitol Hill. And this was that separate the second track that James just talked about, the reconciliation package, or what we are calling the One Big Beautiful Bill.
So just some high-level highlights here. We mentioned the overall cut to discretionary non-defense spending. We've seen this kind of debate play out before. They're definitely prioritizing border security, national security, and they're reducing funding for research and education generally. Sort of their message is, let's send these things back to the states. You'll hear that kind of rhetoric a lot. I think one of the things that's getting swept up in this is a lot of funding cuts for NSF and Department of Education STEM programs. We're going to talk about those in a little bit more detail. That's to some degree cutting off your nose to spite your face, because we're also talking about large investments in domestic manufacturing and other things that are related to innovation and competitiveness in the global economy as a country. And obviously targeting the programs that generate the STEM workforce is not consistent with that. But again, you can see the sort of pivot in the administration's rhetoric to doing education at the state level and not so much at the federal level. And obviously, this is the first stage by the administration in the budget process. Much of what we're going to talk about will face bipartisan opposition in the Congress, but parts of this may well go through. And we're going to talk about some of the things that we as a community can do to influence the outcome of this process.
So to put a finer point on some of the proposals that are most troubling to the STEM education community, the significant, really devastating proposal to slash investments at the National Science Foundation by almost 57% would cut that agency's budget from $9 billion to $3.9 billion. It would cut STEM education programs over there, including what over the last administration was renamed the STEM Education Directorate. It would significantly impact what we have come to know as the National Science Foundation's commitment to broadening participation efforts. Many National Science Foundation grants require grantees to have an element of broadening participation in their work. So much of that work would go away. And it would remain committed to the things that the White House has been talking about in terms of areas important to the country's future, including AI and quantum computing. But it also would dial back commitments to social and behavioral sciences. That's familiar when Republicans are in charge of the White House or on Capitol Hill in charge of the budgets at the foundation. Those investments have come into question multiple times over the years. And the climate sciences, that's not surprising given the rhetoric from the White House. In the short term, or perhaps medium and long term, there are no new awards in FY26 due to prior obligations. You may have heard, we have heard that grantees have had additional work canceled in the last few weeks, and that risks long-term commitment to building the STEM workforce, and ultimately we think could be bad news for the STEM workforce.
At the Department of Education, you see sort of similar trends with regard to how they're handling programs with a different twist. So one of the big proposals within the Department of Education's budget request this year is to consolidate 18 different K-12 programs, including Title I, into what they're calling a simplified $4.5 billion program that would allow states discretion in terms of how they spend federal dollars and not have to spend them within the confines of the 18 different programs that were there. There's been some debate about how much new this is. This sort of mirrors the authority of some of the COVID relief legislation, where it allows states to spend money, within any authorized purpose of the Every Student Succeeds Act, otherwise known as No Child Left Behind, or the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That's the one where all the Title legislation comes from. But nonetheless, what they're proposing is downsizing the role of the Department of Education, eliminating a number of what we would refer to as anchor programs within the Department of Education around STEM. That's the Title IV Part A student support and academic enrichment grants. That's where what used to be the Math and Science Partnership funding was integrated in the 2005 rewrite of this law. It also would eliminate the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program and a host of other federal programs that wrap up into those 18 K-12 programs. Again, I would say this is the part of the debate where I don't think there's going to be any bipartisan support for most of these changes. They may manifest some degree in the House appropriations process, which is controlled by Republicans. But at the end of the day, you need a bipartisan agreement to pass an appropriations bill. And that gets us into territory where essentially nothing changes unless they can reach an agreement on an appropriations bill going forward. So, you've heard Della and I say this numerous times over the course of the last 150 or so days. Many of these changes are not going to find support in Congress, But that's an environment where things can change, things can fall through the cracks. And I think it's on us as a community to be good advocates for STEM education programs, throughout this entire process.
So other agencies got bad news from the White House request. I think that these aren't surprising given the rhetoric we've been hearing since day one of the Trump administration. The National Institutes of Health faces a cut, according to the White House budget request. A number of important areas of research would come under fire. And in addition, the agency would just lose staff, which would arguably affect its ability to fulfill its mission. Other science agencies, NASA would see a significant cut. We've already heard about cuts to the education initiatives over there as well. NOAA would see a significant reduction, and the Department of Energy's Office of Science would suffer a similar fate if the president got his way on spending bills going through Congress. IMLS, which has already been pretty much shut down by DOGE and the White House, would be eliminated altogether. AmeriCorps, same. We've already heard from STEM programs, after school programs, camps, et cetera, of folks who rely on AmeriCorps volunteers to help them serve their communities. Bad news, continued bad news there. And then the agency that oversees AmeriCorps and other important programs, the Corporation for National Community Service, would also face a significant cut, adversely affecting AmeriCorps in a more ongoing way and other civic education initiatives.
So obviously, a lot of this budget news is really hard to see when you look at the sort of the work of our community over a period of time to build up a portfolio of STEM-oriented programs. And so one of the things that we, the STEM Ed Coalition, have done have put out some new grassroots opportunities for the community. This is the Action Center. Allows anybody from the general public to log in and send a letter to members of Congress on several issues. We've got a couple up there now that preceded the budget. We're working on individual letters for specific agencies like NSF and the Department of Education. But this is a place to direct your colleagues to direct your teammates to within the education establishment. If you want to take some action individually and send a letter, it allows us to track that, see who's doing it, follow up with you, and find other opportunities to engage in advocacy. And this is something we've definitely prioritized to make sure people out there in the STEM community have a chance to have their voices heard.
So we've said repeatedly, although I know it's complicated and we use the word budget interchangeably here in Washington, D.C., which is not helpful for folks understanding the two different processes, but let's talk about the big, beautiful bill, which is the budget reconciliation process that is going on right now and is really where so much focus on Capitol Hill is pointed. So the House passed their reconciliation bill just before Memorial Day, by a one vote margin. Speaker Johnson certainly exerted as much political pressure as he could with help from President Trump to get that over the finish line. There was some wrangling of holdouts on the Republican side to get that done. But I think the whole process really showed that he is in a precarious situation in terms of negotiating with his own caucus and getting any subsequent versions of that bill passed in the House. It's currently in the Senate, where there are a number of Republicans who have said that they don't care for provisions that are in there on various issues. So they have said they're going to change that bill. This bill enjoys a particular privilege in the Senate, which requires only 51 votes to pass. That means that Senator Thune, who leads the Republicans in the Senate, faces a similar challenge as did Speaker Johnson in getting it over. There are some other things that are in the mix on this process, including the debt ceiling, which we're supposed to hit as a country in August or September. So that puts some deadline, and nothing motivates Congress quite like a crisis to get something done. You can see here that there are predictions related to what's going on for the country and its revenues and outlays. And this is something that Republicans will seize on, as will Democrats, as this issue continues to move.
So just to dig into what's in the reconciliation bill that's now pending in the Senate, we're going to cover several different areas, and I want to start with some of the changes to student loans and Pell Grants and some of the changes in higher education. So number of changes to student aid eligibility. You can see there's some limitations on non-citizens being eligible for student aid. There are different categories now of exempt assets. In other words, determining what your financial need is going to change, probably be a little bit more narrowly defined. And then there's a cap. I believe it's $200,000 now on the median cost of income borrowing. That meaning the maximum amount you can borrow to go to college is changing under different kinds of subsidized loans. We're going to see some Pell eligibility for part-time students be limited by some of these provisions, and some of the other graduate student loans are going to be changed. These are things that those of you in higher education, your universities have flagged for many members of Congress and the Senate in particular. It is going to change. We'll get to this in a second, but it's going to change how higher education is treated in the tax code and endowments of things of those kind. But there also are some provisions in there to focus on college affordability, and something that you've probably heard me talk for a while about of the notion of risk sharing with regard to unpaid student loans. That's something that's been batted around in various different circles in DC for a long time. That's in the bill. And then there's a whole the administration sort of in parallel to this, and that's why we made the reference of their budget assumes that this bill passes. They've also done some things to suspend the student loan repayment relief that the Biden administration did that assume that this bill passes.
So another area that's of interest to STEM advocates, because child nutrition programs are important to after-school programs and other programs where STEM activities happen, is what's could or might happen to supplemental nutrition assistance program, or what we call SNAP, as well as some other programs out of the agriculture department that provide meals, snacks, other supports for after-school programs and school programs. These are among the provisions that don't enjoy widespread bipartisan support on Capitol Hill and could end up being changed during Senate consideration of the One Big Beautiful Bill.
A few other changes here. The headline is a little bit dated there. These are the tax law changes. And so, one of the big reasons why this bill is in debate at all is because the tax code changes enacted in the first term of the Trump administration back in 2017 are set to expire at the end of this next fiscal year, which creates a motive for a change in tax policy to avoid, quote unquote, increasing taxes because of expiring tax provisions. That's how these things have been structured for more than 20 years now, to create these kind of opportunities to revisit this sort of thing. You can see some of the changes in tax law. So one of the things you've probably seen in the news, there are no longer tax credits for electric vehicles. That's something that's gotten the attention of Elon Musk, created some friction in the administration you may have seen playing out in the press there in the last couple of days. There are changes to the deduction for state and local taxes. This has been another sort of cross-party lines issue of where you live changes how you see the value of giving credit for state taxes. We mentioned earlier, this raises the debt limit for a little more than a year, and that's one of the provisions that sort of has to pass by the August-September timeframe, where we run up against the limit of what we can borrow as the United States government. One of the other big provisions in there is the House bill contains an exemption deductibility for tips. This is another campaign promise. One of the other provisions that's in here that I think has been talked about a little bit was it creates savings accounts for newborns by sort of automatic creation. This is an idea that was actually first proposed by Hillary Clinton in her campaign for presidency in 2016. So it's an interesting idea all the way around. That's one that may actually have some bipartisan support in this bill. So early savings accounts. And then there's a whole bunch of changes in terms of the deductibility of contributions to both K-12 and universities that may change how university endowments fund programs. It's changing how the taxes are calculated for university endowments. Many of those endowments are supporting things like schools attached to universities and community outreach programs. And some of the changes they're proposing may actually change how universities fund some of those programs. So that's another one to keep your eye on if you have an affiliation with a university and you're being supported out of university endowment funds.
Okay, so we're going to take questions in a second, and we're going to turn it over to our colleague Anita to talk about some things that are happening over at the After School STEM Hub.
Thanks, Della, and hi, everyone. James mentioned the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program out of the Department of Education. It's the nation's exclusive sort of dedicated funding stream for after-school programs, and we at the After School Alliance are advocates for 21st century and of advancing after-school and after-school STEM generally. And 21st Century is important, as I said, not just because it's the only dedicated funding stream for after-school, but also our research shows that 90% of 21st century grantees offer STEM, and parents are increasingly choosing programs and prioritizing programs that offer STEM. So it's a really great venue. And the loss of 21st century is a big hit to our efforts to advance STEM across a variety of settings. So in addition to advocating for STEM at all the other science mission agencies that make informal and after-school STEM possible, we'd also love to encourage the field to really advocate for 21st century. And we have stood up a separate website and a campaign called After School Works for America. And you see the slide on this, and you see the website on the slide as well as in the chat. So please do check out the site and the tools that we have available to help you get informed and engaged and advocate to preserve 21st century as a dedicated funding stream for after school so that we can continue promoting STEM learning opportunities in these settings for all children across the United States.
I've seen the AmeriCorps question and am ready to answer it. So the Corporation for National Community Service is by statute the agency that runs AmeriCorps and all its programs. A few years ago, they decided as an agency to just brand themselves as AmeriCorps. The reason I and others who are as old as I am still say Corporation for National Community Service is because when bills are released, et cetera, it is the CNCS that gets the money, and then we all just talk about it in a public way as AmeriCorps. So I suppose the question was prompted by my age and my dedication to statute when talking about funding such things. But yes, AmeriCorps and CNCS are essentially the same thing.
Thank you, Della. One other thing I wanted to underline was, something that you've heard us talk about as a group for the last several months is the need for more grassroots advocacy. And I think you're starting to see this, deployed in real terms. It's easier to focus people's attention when you have some of these specific budget proposals that are out there. And I think you're going to see more to all of these, right? So if you haven't written a letter in a while, you need to get in the habit of doing that, because we've received in the last week in our website, we started to track this. Now we have hundreds of people a day logging onto our advocacy website. That needs to be thousands and 10,000s, right? We get about a million hits a month on our website, and so that's still a small percentage of people actually taking action. And so I can't say enough of do this while you're still on the call. Make an effort to encourage your friends and colleagues to do it, because one of the reasons why we're interacting digitally this way is so many education organizations no longer have trips they fund to Washington, D.C. on a regular basis as maybe you might used to do. So this is part of our civic responsibility to make sure our voices are heard. So any other questions?
If I can just jump on that, James, I'll just say that, one of the reasons that after school is such a bipartisan issue with such public support for it is because there is a dedicated advocacy organization like the After School Alliance that is activating the public. And so we see evidence for the impact of really of the public and parents engaging. So I'm just wanting to second James's point. We've already had about 40,000 emails that have been sent to Congress since May and saying, please don't remove 21st century as a dedicated funding stream for after school. And we need to see that happening for STEM as well. So absolutely do what James is saying.
So I see a question in here from Tyler Clothcorn. No new awards in FY26. So this has definitely gotten a lot of attention for the National Science Foundation. Again, first things first, this is a budget request, and I don't think Congress is going to appropriate a 60% decrease in the budget for the National Science Foundation, right? Might be something of a decrease, but that would be incredibly ahistorical for NSF to do that. And so I think, notwithstanding, I think NSF will be making awards next year, not just continuation of effort for their existing grants, but that's definitely what the administration has put out there as a proposal. And I think, politically speaking, I think that's sort of goalposting, right? They put out the most extreme proposal they could put out with regard to agency science budgets across the board because they're trying to put pressure on research at universities, and they're trying to sort of, engage in a conversation about whose responsibility is it to fund certain things. But I don't think there's much appetite in Congress to adhere to those kinds of levels of changes. You may see some changes to social science programs and some of the programs within the STEM directorate, but not to that degree.
Right, thank you, James and Della. I'm just gonna hop in here just to help moderate a little bit of the Q&A in the time we have remaining. Hey everyone, I'm Leslie Brooks. I'm the STEM manager at the After School Alliance, and with Anita, I help run our After School STEM Hub. I think the majority of the questions in the chat were answered. There was one more that just popped up, so we'll answer that too. But I just wanted to ask you, James and Della, where do opportunities currently lie with, the the current administration's priorities, would you say?
Well, I'll point to a couple of things. I appreciate the question, Leslie. One of the themes that we have talked about as a coalition for a long time is what we would call workforce alignment. The idea that education programs are lined up to the priorities of the economy. That's a theme I think you will see emphasized more and increasingly at the state and local level of how are we showing so there were questions in the chat about how do we show sort of the metrics of success for STEM education programs. I think one category you're going to see is anything that in your STEM program that's contributing to workforce success or economic development is going to get easier to make that case in this environment, but that comes at the cost of so many of the other aspects of STEM education programs, whether they're focused on broadening participation or they're focused on youth engagement, some of those other things. So that's one place I would point to. And the second is, this is something, Della can speak to better than I can, but I am interested to see the emphasis in the administration on artificial intelligence and where that's going, because they're continuing this trend of focusing on computer science was 7 or 8 years ago, and that was sort of cutting edge. Advanced manufacturing, quantum technology, AI, those sorts of things are the things you still see popping into the priorities of the administration to the extent that they have them for research agencies.
I'll speak a little bit more on AI education and what the administration is doing or hopes to do. So I think we all know that there was an executive order on AI, and Leslie put the link to it in the chat. And in April, it was signed. And since then, a number of agencies have been engaged in trying to put together a plan on how the federal government can support AI education in the name of making sure that AI is used responsibly, that young people know what it is, young people know how to use it ethically and responsibly, but in addition, how teachers can use it in classrooms to maximize their ability to reach different kinds of learners, all the promise that AI has in K-12 education. And so we have talked to folks at the Department of Education about how they might use existing programs to fulfill the goals of that executive order. And they have talked about using some of the very programs that they say they want to get rid of to do just that, invest in teacher professional development and other things to help teachers use that innovation more effectively. I think that the department, if you missed it, the department put out some priorities a couple weeks ago that should guide some of their competitive grant awards. They're saying they might do additional ones that would have a preference for AI strategies, et cetera, in awards.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think we have one more follow-up question to that. Where can we follow information on the AI task force?
Oh, the AI
Is there a
task force,
forum
the
to
White House
provide
AI
feedback?
task force, it's outlined in the executive order. It's the heads of those agencies. It's not anybody from the outside.
Well, thank you so much. We're at 30 minutes, so I'm going to pass it back off to Ginny Frank to close us out. And then I will also share in the chat a link to a crowdsourced, if you all are interested or want to also add insights, you have a crowdsourced database for terminated National Science Foundation awards just for awareness.
Well, thank you always to our guests. Thank you to all of you for joining us today in your 30-minute pulse check on policy and advocacy. We will always be sending out a follow-up email with resources and links that we've shared, as well as registration. We hope that you share this registration. We now have a set time. It is the first Thursday of every month. So our next session will be on July 3rd, and we hope to see you there. Please be sure to send us any questions or comments, reach out to anyone on the panel. We are always excited to engage in these conversations and learn more about the work that you're doing and some of the ways that you are addressing the barriers or challenges to continue to do the good work. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and we'll see you on July 3rd. To learn more about the work of STEM Education Coalition, After School STEM Hub, and STEM ecosystems, please visit our websites. Until next time, keep advocating for a strong STEM education and workforce nationwide.